Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Laura D'Andrea Tyson, who is the class of 1939 professor of economics and business at UC Berkeley. In the first Clinton administration, she served as National Economic Council Chair and as chairperson of the Council of Economic Advisors. Before going to Washington, Professor Tyson served as director of the Institute of International Studies and was a founding director of the Berkeley Roundtable on the International Economy. Her publications include Who's Bashing Whom, Trade, Conflict, and High Technology Industries. Laura, welcome back to Berkeley.
Thank you very much.
How did your growing up years prepare you for the road toward public service? I got to ask you that.
My growing up years?
Yes.
Well, I think, the main thing for me was somewhere, I suppose, between high school and college, or certainly in college, it really was thinking about public policy. So those were the kinds of issues that interested me, and it never interested me to run for office. I want to emphasize that's not what I mean. I did never even run for a school office. But it did interest me to try to figure out a way to address some national issues like poverty or international trade or whatever, and that was true from pretty early on. And
I gather you were good at math, basically. That was one of the skills. Yeah.
Yes, I was good at math. But at a certain point, I wanted to find a way to use math to link it to these public policy concerns rather than math for its own sake.
In the accounts of your service in Washington, I'm going to flatter you now, you're described as standing your ground in policy debates, a great educator of politicians and the public, and a person who doesn't take things personally. Without making you blush, and if you will accept those compliments, how were those skills honed, basically, do you think?
Well, I had an ideal job for an academic in Washington. My job really was to give economic advice. I didn't run any programs, and I wasn't after any office. So the only thing I had to offer was my advice. And I took that very seriously. I thought that when I went into a room, if I didn't say what I thought or what my profession thought about an issue, that I wasn't doing my job, even if what I said was not politically easy for the listeners to accept.
So this gave you a focus?
It gave me a definition, a job definition, and a focus. And I said to myself many times, if I don't give this advice, then I'm not doing my job. I also said, if I'm not credible, if I go out and speak publicly, but I speak in a way which is not believable, then I will be of much less value to the administration. So that allowed me to hold my ground in terms of saying what I thought rather than what someone told me to say.
And why did you go into economics?
Well, economics gets back to the math question. I was looking for a way to take my interest in mathematics and my interest in sort of analytical ways of thinking about the world and apply them in a public policy arena. And when I took an economics class in sophomore year of college, I realized almost instantly that this was the right connection. It's a very analytical way of thinking, logic, scientific. You can use a fair amount of math in it if you want. But it was all about the kinds of issues that in my sort of private life I worried a lot about or read a lot about. And
you went to MIT.
Yes, I did.
Were there a lot of women going into economics at MIT when you were there? Or were they just starting to be more?
There weren't many. There were many fewer than today. I think in the class of about nearly 30, there were 4 women who started, 1 who dropped out very quickly. But 3 of us finished, and actually the 3 of us are full-fledged practicing economists. What was different about MIT, I had gone to a women's college, Smith College, and of course there was no such thing as a male discipline. All disciplines were, by definition, female disciplines. Yeah. When I got to MIT, I was old enough, I guess, that it didn't bother me too much that my class was primarily all of a sudden men. The issue really was that MIT was a much more abstract and theoretical approach to economics than Smith College had been. So I had to make a kind of transition to a different kind of economics. Now, many students in economics have to make that transition. Undergraduate, the way you teach undergraduates in economics and the way you teach them graduate school is quite different.
And who did you study under at MIT?
Well, I studied under a great group of people, a professor named Evsey Domar, who actually was an expert on the Soviet Union, at the time called the Soviet Union, of course. I was very interested in comparative economics, how other societies handle the same economic problems as the United States. He became a great mentor and supporter of mine. I worked with a young faculty member, very new to the field, named Duncan Foley, who is still in the field and was excellent in terms of, again, his wife was getting a PhD at Harvard, and he was very supportive of women in PhD programs. And then some of the big names in the field, in addition, I worked with Bob Solow and Les Thoreau.
And when did you get into political economy, which I guess even in your early work is something...
I think I was always in political economy.
Yeah.
I always thought when I went to graduate school that I was going to study economics to apply to policy, political problems. In fact, when I went to graduate school in economics, I thought very seriously about going to public policy instead. Almost went to get a public policy degree instead. And when I was at graduate school, my intention really was to work for an organization like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. So my goal was always to use economics as a discipline to address certain policy challenges.
One of the skills that you developed somewhere here, and I want to ask you about that, is a capacity to communicate clearly about what are often very dense and complicated issues, especially writing about them. We'll talk about some of your recent op-ed pieces, but where did you learn that? How was that skill honed?
Well, I do believe that you can learn things by practice. I first learned how to be clear about economics through teaching. Now, I think one thing that helped me, frankly, was that economics was not an easy discipline for me. It was a challenging discipline. It was something that I had to think about seriously and convince myself that I could follow the logic. So because of that, because in some sense it wasn't intuitive for me, I have been, I guess, quite likely when I sit down with someone to do it step by step, because that's how I understand it. And I honed those skills by just doing classes, class after class. You know, I started teaching in 1973, and I got better. Now, as far as writing is concerned, that also is something which comes with practice. I don't think I'm a sort of, it's not easy for me to write. Some people can sit down and just sort of polish something off. I tend to write so that the first version is very close to the last version. And so I agonize over, particularly over introductions, first paragraphs. But again, I worked for a while. I served on the board of editors of the Los Angeles Times, and therefore I was writing about every 6 weeks. And I just got better. I also, frankly, learned some pointers from my husband, who is a professional writer. And when I started doing op-ed pieces for the LA Times, he was very helpful to me in terms of thinking about structure and grabbing introductory sentences, things like that.
Do you also have models in great economists who also were great writers?
Well, I think there have been some very gifted writers among my profession. They tend to be rare, and they're very gifted. I would not compare myself to them. If you take John Maynard Keynes and you go back and read some of his work, I just quoted something of his in an op-ed piece I'm working on about the Asian financial crisis, and it's a beautiful quote. John Kenneth Galbraith is a modern version in the sense of being someone who really has the ability to write literature, who's also writing economics. I aspire to, I think, clarity.
Right. Okay. What was it hard starting out in economics once you have your degree because you were a woman? Was there any discrimination, latent or not latent, that you encountered?
Well, I actually think in my own life, because of timing, that I was helped by being a woman on balance. It's different. It is different. But clearly for me, I came into the graduate program and entered the job market for economists at a time when there was increasing attention being paid to the issue of getting women into the profession. So I think that clearly my first job, even going back to MIT, when I was admitted to MIT, I was the first student who had ever been admitted to MIT from Smith College. I think MIT thought they were basically taking a chance. They were going to see if a very good student from Smith College, a summa cum laude student from Smith College, could make it in that program. And so I feel in several points in my life being a woman has been helpful to me in terms of attracting someone's attention. Oh, okay, we'll take a chance. Now, with that, of course, you then have to make the most of the chance. You have to show people, yes, you can do it. And so that really is, I feel quite comfortable with the view, even with President Clinton, that when I met him, I was of interest to him in part because he really wanted to have a diverse cabinet. But frankly, I ended up working well for him, not because I was a woman, but because of my abilities to deal with economic issues. Are there downsides to being a woman? You know, it's just different. I mean, I will say, just as an example, we used to have White House meetings at 7:30 in the morning. And the way Leon Panetta ran the meetings, they tended to oftentimes be a kind of people jumping in. In general, women are less adept or less willing to just jump into conversations. I think they're more likely to do better in structured conversations. So that's an example of a negative. I think that it's still the case today that if you sort of look at the press and look at how many times women are quoted versus men, things like that, that there is a tendency still to perceive power and wisdom more with men than women. But on balance, I think it's been a positive in my life.
So, but in a way you're saying that even an administration like the Clinton administration, which was very committed to filling roles with women, that there still are structural problems, and once they're surmounted, then you're judged on your merit, basically. Is that a fair? Yeah.
Well, it's not, I would say structural as well as they're almost behavioral issues. I mean, men and women, I do believe, behave differently in some respects, and there are these interesting books by on sort of how women and men handle conversation differently and handle words differently, and meetings. She actually has some very interesting discussions of meetings, which I think captured very much the kind of difference that I mentioned before.
Substantively, when you started out, you really were working on the Yugoslav economy and issues related to the changes in East European economy.
In planned economies.
In planned economies. But by the time you went to Washington, you were really working on issues of competitiveness, industrial policy, comparative, but also very much focused on the United States. Tell us a little about that transition. Were you still committed to the same subjects in a way, but you wound up just moving to a different subfield?
Well, I was always interested in international issues. So much of the work I did on Eastern Europe was about its trade, about foreign investment, about its relationships with the International Monetary Fund, about how it responded to its international debt crisis. So there was always an international component. The second thing is that I was interested in sort of big national comparisons, like how do countries compare on savings and investment rates, or how they handle inflation, or how they try to generate an economic system which supports low levels of unemployment. So you can ask these kinds of questions in any setting. You can ask them in a planned economy, how do they do that? And you can ask it in England or France. So I started to teach more broadly on these broad comparative issues, and I started to move out of just talking about the Soviet Union and Central Europe to talking about Western Europe, and then to Asia. And I started doing some joint teaching with a colleague of mine that you know, John Zeisman, who I had known in graduate school. He and I had been at MIT. He was in political science. I was in economics. We started to team teach or teach one another's classes. He was very interested in Western Europe, and that got me interested in thinking about these kinds of competitive comparisons among advanced industrial countries. And frankly, back when I made this transition, which was really in the early 1980s, it was still almost a decade before anything really started to happen in Central Europe. And I was getting a little bored. I mean, I understood the problems. I think people did understand the problems. And basically, in terms of solving economic problems, there was just a tremendous political barrier to making any forward steps. So it was also lack of interest in what I had been doing.
How did you wind up in Washington?
Well, that really involves, I think, the phenomenon of networks in the United States or in any society. First of all, I think that my choice of graduate school was very important to everything that happened to me thereafter. MIT is it has a outstanding reputation in the field of economics. Its students are very well placed at the best institutions around the country. So I first had a job at Princeton, then I had a job at Berkeley. I started to develop my reputation for being both an effective teacher and for asking interesting questions. That led to my being invited to at a certain point to teach for a year at MIT, and then to teach for a year at the Harvard Business School. And at the Harvard Business School, I got to know Bob Reich, who became Secretary of Labor, was a very close friend of the Clintons. And it was really that network which led me to being introduced to the president when he was a candidate. And from there on, I mean, it really took on the issue of what kind of cabinet did he want, what kind of economic advice did he want, who did he feel comfortable with.
How would you characterize the differences between the realm of politics and public service and the realm of academic life? I mean, here you were a professor at Berkeley, you know, and all that conjures up, and then for the next 4 years you're in the middle, you know, at the very top in Washington. What was the difference?
My husband claims, and I guess I would agree with him, that my ability to get through in Washington, my ability to do well in Washington was not really predictable. I mean, I really didn't have any experience or history which would have suggested I would go into this environment of sort of political figures and convince them that I had reason to be in the room, or convince them that I had reason to be at the table. I think that, again, I would go back to the special nature of my assignments there. I felt that what I did in the university, which was to explain economics, to explain trade-offs, I never try in my teaching to tell people the right thing to do. I try to help people develop the logic to make that decision on their own. So a lot of what I tried to do in the classroom, or what I tried to do, increasingly I did some consulting before I went to Washington, what I tried to do with business leaders was to explain the economic trade-offs and help them think through a decision. And I just did the same thing in Washington. And I guess the other thing that was true is that I did believe, and somehow this may be about who I am as a person, I certainly believed in what we were doing. And because I believed in what we were doing, I was very energetic and able to defend it, to explain it, to try to convince people that we were doing the right thing.
Now, in the profiles I read of you, one of the things that stood out from your early years was cheerleading and numbers. And what you just said may say that you developed some skills back there, and I mean both in a positive way.
Right, I understand. Yeah. Well, you know, on the cheerleading thing, I will only say one thing that I will never forget. It's a very interesting fact. When I was just finished with graduate school, the National Science Foundation had a conference, and they invited women who had gotten PhDs in scientific, quote-unquote, fields from the previous 5 to 7 years to come to Washington and talk about their experience, what made them get a PhD in a scientific, therefore male-dominated field. And these women did not have that much in common, but I want to tell you that the majority, the vast majority of them, had been cheerleaders. Now, what does that tell you? I think it tells you that when these women had grown up, it was still prior to competitive sports for women. There were no teams for women. There was no. So what women did who sort of wanted to be competitive, wanted to be sort of out there in sort of involved with the school and sort of part of the team was cheerleading. So it may say something about my competitive nature, it may say something about my outgoing nature, it may say something about my ability to associate with a team. I was considered a team player in Washington. And the numbers, well, I don't know, you know, that's just something that I don't quite understand. I always enjoyed math, but not so much that I was willing to basically commit my entire life to it.
But we've just disproved your husband in a way. There were things in your background that, you know.
You know.
Yes, that's right. In Washington, you earned a reputation as a communicator and an analyst. And one of the things you were quoted as saying in a profile that I read is that what you do best is present the facts at odds with public perception, that you felt very comfortable in that role. Let's talk about your reactions and your experiences in confronting the irrational, symbolic side of politics, where people really don't want to look at the evidence, they don't want to look at the facts.
Well, I think that I had different roles in the administration. I did a lot of representing the administration with the national media and the print media and the television media. And there I felt that, as I mentioned before, the key thing was credibility, and therefore that if I presented the facts and tried to present them in a clear and unbiased way and tried to defend my presentation when called upon, that that's what people wanted to hear. They didn't want to have me posturing or basically. And you know, at one point I went to a conference as an administration official in Aspen, and it was a big conference primarily of very high-ranking Republicans, and the speaker before me was Senator Dole. And I was the only Clinton administration official that was there, and it was not a supportive audience. It was quite a hostile audience. But I actually won over a lot of the audience. Not that I convinced them to change their positions, but they believed that I was earnestly trying to explain the situation, how I understood it while we were doing what we were doing. And frankly, the other thing you need to do as a professional economist is recognize all the time the limitations on our knowledge. Nothing is perfect. So you say, well, we think this kind of tax increase. That's always been the big issue with Republicans. While it was not our goal to come in and raise taxes on the top 1.5% of the American population, we felt that given all of the economic and political constraints that we confronted, the only way to get this deficit reduction path in place was to accept this. It was a trade-off. Were there costs to that? Sure, there were political costs, and there were even some economic costs. And if you say that to people, so you've given them a sort of full representation of the situation, they're more likely to believe you. Now, inside the halls of the administration, that approach also worked very well, just going in and basically taking the arguments and the facts and trying to present trade-offs. Where it worked less well, and perhaps not well at all, was in testimony before Congress. Because the testimony before Congress really is much more about posturing and criticizing or defending than it is about explication or understanding.
What idea did you take to Washington? I know that right before you went, you had written this book on who's bashing whom. Do you think that what you did in Washington on those issues was consistent with what you had written, or did your ideas about the way things work change when you were in Washington?
Well, I think by and large, there was consistency. I do think that you learn when you're in that situation what the limits of what is feasible and what is not feasible.
Mm-hmm.
And the feasibility limitations can actually be from political constraints.
Mm-hmm.
So let me sort of suggest where it's consistent and then some of the constraints. Where it's consistent is if for people, there was a lot of criticism of that book by people who never read it. And they claimed that I was protectionist, that I was a sort of heavy enthusiast of industrial policy. Basically what the book says is most of the U.S. Economic competitive loss which occurred between the mid-1980s and the early 1990s was self-induced, that the main things we should worry about were getting our macroeconomic house in order, continuing to spend on research and development, and working to bring down trade barriers around the world. Not build them up here, but bring them down. That where we had serious bilateral conflicts, particularly with Japan and with the Europeans, we needed to not assume that we would be better off if they broke the rules or didn't play by the rules. We needed to recognize that it was in our interest to use our negotiating policy and occasionally, rarely, but occasionally, the threat or actual use of a sanction to get them to change their behavior. I think we behaved in Washington very consistently with all of those policy views. Now, where would I say limitations existed? I mean, just on the example of trade policy issues. You know, we did develop a sectorally oriented trade approach with Japan. Now, I would say that there was a lot of debate about what sectors should be on our sectorally oriented approach. Some sectors, I think, fit my notion of what should be on there, and some didn't. And why did ones get on that didn't fit my sort of notion of high technology and research and development and forward-looking? Well, because there are political reasons why things get on a list as well as economic. So I say that's a feasibility constraint. Maybe that just means that you know some of the decisions are made on economic logic and some of them are made on political logic.
As you navigated this transition and you watched ideas that you had in the academy applied, what surprised you most about political life? Anything in particular about the way ideas work their way through the system? Well, I guess the most revealing example, I have a couple examples. They're back in 1993 when we were talking about how much deficit reduction to introduce into the president's budget proposal. There was a big debate about whether we should, whether it mattered to the economy if we had a $500 billion target or a $480 billion target. And the reason this became a hot topic was because in order to get to the $500 billion topic, we had to do some really undesirable things, like make the tax rate increase retroactive. Now, I argued that, you know, we have a $6 trillion economy. $20 billion over 5 years is nothing. It's minuscule. And that argument was basically, it was overruled by the notion that the only way we could make this politically saleable, this was not just the administration's position, it was the Democrats in Congress. The only way we could get the Democrats in Congress to support us was make it a certain figure, a figure itself which had no particular economic logic. So that was I learned a lot from that experience because I would bring in all this evidence. People say, well, and I think that another example, which I'll just then go to 1996, there's sort of these are things which, in 1996, we had proposed, or someone in the Treasury had proposed that we eliminate capital gains on housing as a tax simplification measure because Americans who buy houses and do make improvements, when they sell the house, it used to be the case that you had to show all your improvements, keep all those records, so you could show what your actual capital gains was. And we were looking for tax simplification ideas. Well, over time, over the course of 1996, this idea moved from a tax simplification idea to a tax break
It's not really a tax break. Most people actually never paid capital gains on their house. Most people didn't even keep the paperwork. But it became a tax break, and the Republicans also proposed a tax break. So here is a tax proposal which had very small significance in terms of simplification. It has no merit in terms of economic effect, and it became something that is now part of the tax code. And the most interesting thing about that is to my knowledge, there was never any, this was not because there was a groundswell of support for such a position. This actually came from the top down rather than from the bottom up. Very interesting phenomenon.
So what was the most important economic issue that the Clinton administration confronted when you came in? The deficit?
I think so. I think it was. I would put it differently. It was how to get the U.S. economy on a path which would take away this, what economists call a structural deficit problem. The issue was that, of course, as a result of the savings and loan crisis and the war with Iraq, the deficit had gotten much bigger than anyone had predicted. So it was $290 billion. That was one concern. But the real concern was that even if you predicted the economy's growth path as a positive growth path, the deficit predictions were getting larger, not smaller, which is not a sustainable position. And it had been a position which the U.S. had been in from the early 1980s. I remember sitting in the Institute of International Studies in the conference room when Ronald Reagan was elected president with a bunch of economists and political scientists from Berkeley, and we talked about the consequence of his election was going to be big tax cuts, big increases in military spending, and a huge deficit. And that is what happened. And it really was only in the 1990s, more than a decade later, that the U.S. took action, really with President Clinton's leadership, to bring that problem under control. So yes, it was the single largest problem.
And are you surprised by how remarkably positive what you did was?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, in the sense that I think we did the right thing, but I think all of us were surprised and continue to be surprised at how well the economy is done. I mean, there's a lot of things going on here that we don't entirely understand. I mean, why is the inflation rate so much lower? Why can the economy have an unemployment rate that's averaging below 5% and not have cost pressure coming from the labor market side? Why does productivity growth look like it's increasing? The thing that our logic was very simple, and it was that if you reduce the deficit in a credible way, you will support more investment. You'll create a climate more conducive to investment, and that's good for the economy in the long run. But we were very careful to tell the president that there might not be any dramatic benefits in the short run. And then things went much better than expected.
Were you surprised by the constraints on the administration and, for example, dealing with the international bond market, or was this something that, through your study and work, was not surprising to you? Or were you that constrained by the bond? It's an assumption.
Well, I understood it differently, which is that basically, and I think you can see the power of global markets today, financial markets today in Asia. We have a world in which there are these tremendous flows of capital that move across borders. They respond to their interpretation of what nations are doing. The U.S., really from about the mid-1980s till about 1994, was considered by the rest of the global community to be behaving in a very irresponsible way. Why should why should the richest nation in the world become the largest debtor nation in the world? Why were we not saving and lending to the rest of the world rather than borrowing from the rest of the world? That kind of perception can become a very powerful source of action. And I think we believed that, number one, the U.S. government was probably at that point paying a premium in terms of its borrowing costs because of expectations that its borrowing needs were going to get greater over time. So we believe we could bring long-term interest rates down, get that premium out of there. We frankly were also concerned that if we didn't do it, at some point, no one could predict when, there might be a real move against U.S. Treasury bonds and a real decline in the dollar and a real spike up in interest rate, a kind of U.S. version of a financial crisis, which which was out there as a possibility.
So in a way, it related to the symbolic dimension on some that was not unimportant in this.
Look, markets, I think, again, since we're sitting in the middle of a financial crisis in Asia, one of the things that that these kinds of situations demonstrate so clearly is that so much of this is about confidence, and so much of the confidence is based on perception rather than actual knowledge. So people who invested heavily in Asia up through the third quarter of 1997. It was the same systems. Whatever you think of the systems, I happen to think they're very strong, good economic fundamentals. But now you read about them, it sounds like, how could anybody have been foolish enough to put their money there? Well, the perception through the third quarter of 1997 was these were great places to put their money, and then investors lost confidence and everybody headed for the door. You have got to be careful to do the right thing and to describe what you're doing because you could lose that confidence, and once you lose it, it's very hard to get back.
Before we talk about the Asia situation, which I would like to do, I would like to ask you about two fronts that as a liberal Democratic administration or a moderate Democratic administration, the Clinton administration did not succeed or was not able to come, and that is health care reform and income inequality.
Right.
Resolving those issues. I don't know if the two are related, but are there some general thoughts here about the limits of reform and addressing issues that an administration like this confronted?
Well, I think they're different. The reasons for the inability to address these issues are different.
Okay.
So in health, I think we did have, since healthcare is about 14% of the American economy, there are vast economic interests that are wedded to the current configuration of the healthcare system. And we can see that now in the sort of pressures that are playing out over managed care, that doctors are threatening to unionize and managed care providers are under attack now for, are they preventing necessary procedures? So the point is there are huge vested interests in this part of the economy. If you decide to take it on sort of completely, as one fell swoop, you are going to handle Medicare, Medicaid, the uninsured, cost containment, and the federal government's budget deficit all at once, you are going to have a very elaborate plan, and you are going to mobilize a very large number of opponents. So we did both. We had a very elaborate plan that was very hard to explain to anyone. And one of the things you certainly learn, it goes back to our discussion about perception, is the importance and power of message in political life. It's not just, do you have a good policy? It is, can you explain the policy in a very short period of time, in essentially a soundbite period of time. We did not have such a policy. The second point is we did mobilize every possible constituency group against us.
That's
we
right.
thought we were going to have the leaders of large American corporations because they were suffering from high health care costs. But then they looked at the proposal and said, you know, we may end up here having to give up our own efforts to cut costs, and the government may be less successful, so we're not going to support this. We thought we were going to get the absolute outstanding support of the Medicare population because we were going to give them prescription drug coverage. But the Medicare population, while they decided to be supportive, were actually kind of concerned because we were going to cut Medicare and then kind of put the money back in a different way. And I could go on and on, the insurers, the doctors, the hospitals.
Right. All arrayed against you. What about income inequality?
So let me just say,
Oh, yeah,
finish up
sorry.
on health,
Yeah,
though.
sorry.
I think in a way, we approached it the wrong way because I think a lesson here, and it's also a lesson from the Republican Revolution of 1995, for then playing out in 1995 is if you overreach, if you try to do too much at once, then you may end up accomplishing very little. That's the way, our system is one of checks and balances and marginal steps. And except in crisis situations, and the healthcare situation was not a crisis in the United States, it's a serious problem, I don't think our system is really organized to make big steps. Since that time, of course, as you know, the administration has achieved some successes on health care in smaller steps, greater coverage of children, insurance market reform to help with issues of excluding restrictions which make it difficult for people to get health care. The administration brought down, increased the tax deductibility of health care spending for the self-employed. So there are a number of things which have helped. Now, of course, we have this proposal to extend Medicare down in age to cover people who are not yet retired but can't get health insurance another way. And we did protect the Medicaid as a guarantee. So there really were some accomplishments in health. But they're marginal. That is, that's the way we made, once you, not marginal in their entirety, but incremental. Let me use the word incremental. Income inequality is a much different issue. The reason it's hard to deal with is that no one entirely understands its causes. And the causes we do understand are very hard to do anything about, at least in the short run. So the theories about why income inequality has increased in the United States range from trade and immigration pressures, which have probably played some role, though not nearly as large a role as people think. Now, what does that mean? It means that people at, particularly with just a high school education or less, have been competing with unskilled workers around the world and with unskilled workers who have moved to the United States, so it's put downward pressure on their income. A second factor is that is, and a much more powerful factor, it seems, is the changing demands of technology. So having a high school education, which used to be a path to a good middle income life, is simply, that path is closed off. You can't do it. Because that had been primarily through manufacturing jobs. Manufacturing productivity has increased dramatically, but the number of people who are therefore in manufacturing jobs has not grown rapidly. People are moving into sort of service sector jobs, and there's a bifurcation. You can have a good service sector job if you're computer literate or you're a software engineer or anything to do with computers, frankly. If you're not, it's much harder. Then you're going to get into retail services. You're going to get into household services where the wages are simply not attractive relative to high wage jobs. So I think you have these changes in technology, changes in global competition, which are huge forces. They're operating everywhere around the world, and there's not that much that a national policy environment can do. I think we actually did a number of things. We cut taxes for the bottom 20% through an expansion of what's called the Earned Income Tax Credit. We managed to get Congress to pass, after they said they would never do it, a significant increase in the minimum wage. We have devoted, or there's much more devoted now to spending on education, educational opportunity really focused at, I would say, after high school. In a way, the focus has been on, now it's going to preschool, sort of certain critical moments in the educational life of an individual that matter to their long-run ability to get the skills needed for modern technology.
And the administration also increased the minimum wage, which relates to the weakening power of the unions, which you've identified.
The weakening power of the unions is a real issue. I don't think that there's, again, the reasons for that have a lot to do with sort of the change in the composition of the workforce, because the manufacturing sector was much more unionized than the service sector is. Now the current, the relatively new AFL-CIO union leadership is trying to do more unionization among service workers. And frankly, I think stronger unions on balance would help address this problem of income inequality. On the other hand, I think that the American Union movement is really in the wrong place on issues of international trade. So, I mean, I both want them to be successful because I think that they have been a powerful force for compressing inequality over time. But I think that I hope they become a little more forward-looking on trade issues.
Tell us about what you think is President Clinton's most outstanding leadership quality, or is there something about the way that he led that you were heartened by and were surprised about? Is there something about leadership you learned from him?
Well, I would say a couple of points which have been made, I think are true. There are certain times, and I think the budget of 1993, the health care effort in 1994, the effort to help Mexico through difficult financial circumstances in 1995, and his whole commitment to trade liberalization despite the opposition of his Democratic base are all clear indications of both a vision, a knowledge of what he wanted to accomplish, and character, that is, a willingness to endure serious political risk and to do things that were unpopular. The second point I would say, though, in addition, is that he is a very gifted political figure. And what that means is that he understands the necessity of compromise. And he finally would rather get something done than stand for something that cannot be done. You can commit yourself to something that you would like to do and talk about it. But, and he does that. He's very good, I think, because of his ability to speak clearly and in a very down-to-earth fashion. I think he can really communicate with the American people, which is another part of his skill. But I think he also understands that you don't just say, well, if I can't have everything, I'll take nothing. He tried that. In a sense, that was health care. That was the closest we came. But in most other issues, he, I think, was willing to compromise. And some people interpreted that to be a kind of lack of a lack of vision. I honestly don't think so. I think there's a vision and a political ability that are work together.
As we do this interview, we're, as we were mentioning earlier, overtaken by the turn of events in Asia.
Right.
And I'm curious for your thoughts about what the dominoes apparently falling in that region, Thailand, Indonesia, Korea, which were perceived as being so strong and in some ways as a kind of a threat to the United States and so on. What this sharp turn in events tells us about globalization and the management of the international economy, drawing on your experience, because that's partly what y'all dealt with as you just described in the
well, you know, I think we dealt with this in a much smaller and it turned out easier to contain fashion in Mexico. And when it is a kind of, I think, very defining moment in terms of leadership for the president, because there was very little support in the press and very little support in the Congress and very little support in the public for any sort of bailout of Mexico. What the president understood, and it was really almost instinctive, he didn't need to be convinced, was that U.S. interests, whether they were economic interests or military interests or democratic interests, were at risk from a destabilized Mexico financial situation. And that it was in the interest of the United States to use its capabilities for leadership and its resources to stabilize that. And I think that's the same thing that's true now. It's not that, you know, Japan has been, and I believe at some point will be again, a serious competitor for the United States. It is, in fact, still a serious competitor for the United States if you look in particular industries. South Korea was becoming a serious competitor. And I think that the recognition of leadership is that you want to have these parts of the world be stable, and you want them to be prosperous. Yeah, they may pose a competitive threat, but you're on balance much better off having a healthy trading partners than you are having debilitated trading partners. You're much better off if you can spend, a couple $2 billion to stabilize, to prevent a debt default in South Korea, than if South Korea defaults and you end up having to pick up the bill for work that South Korea was going to do with North Korea on the nuclear reactor. So you have to, I think, realize, and I think the President instinctively realizes this, that in the global system that we now live, you cannot distinguish very clearly between our military security, our national security, and our economic security. They're all part of the same system. The second thing I think he understands, and I think that Alan Greenspan understands this, and that we understood it in the administration, we the economic team, is that globalization, like almost all other economic forces, has its pluses and its minuses. So the same technologies and the same financial innovations that could pull billions of dollars of capital into South Korea or into Thailand in a couple of years could allow that capital to migrate in a couple of days. And the volatility of capital markets and the magnitude of their swings have both been increased by the ability of the system to move money around. On the other hand, on the good side, just think about all the investment opportunities that would never have been funded in these countries that are good investment opportunities if the money hadn't been available. Or think about all of the Americans and who might have wanted to invest in these economies that would not have had the opportunity to do so. So the world is one of imperfection. You have to take the good with the bad. And then you always work to make the good better and control the bad.
Is that your philosophy of government, actually?
My philosophy of government is that, some people went to Washington, and I think their experience in Washington probably left them frustrated because they had hoped to be able to accomplish more, to get closer to their ideal of whatever it is they wanted to accomplish. My own sense was I went with some doubt that much could be accomplished, and I felt that relative to the constraints, we actually did, on balance, the right thing. So I left feeling probably at least as positive, if not more positive, than when I first went into the administration. And I have friends who I would say that's not true for. They are more frustrated. They wanted it to be more perfect. Maybe that is the power of economics. Economics is a dismal science. We don't believe things are perfect. We don't believe there are free lunches. We believe there are trade-offs and costs and sacrifices. And I think that I'm going to do my entire introductory economics class this spring all about that, because that is the most important insight into policy making. Can't have it all.
One final question. How would you advise students to prepare for the future and for a role in public service if they envision it?
Well, I think there are, first of all, I think they need to prepare, and I think the students I will see understand this, by a broad education which gives them a real feel for the rest of the world, because it is the case that we're so deeply embedded now with the rest of the world that in order to understand, the prospects for the U.S. economy in 1998, you do have to understand what's happened in Asia. And I think that one of the goals I would have for having an undergraduate education at Berkeley is at the end of that process, whether you took economics or not, you should know enough to be able to make those links. So I think that is a very critical part of living in the global economy. I think it's also critically important for people to become technologically literate. Now I have to say that for me, this is a kind of generational issue. I'm less technologically literate than younger people, but I'm trying to catch up. But I think that younger people recognize more clearly you've got to understand this technology. You've got to understand what it can do for you and how you can use it as a research tool.
And what skill most enables you to survive in the public sector?
dear. I honestly think the ability to say what you really think, but to be willing to listen to what someone else thinks. That is, if you are an ideologue, if you are absolutely committed to your position, then I think unless you're a politician, that is going to be a very difficult place for you to be. If you are a policy person, I think you have to be sure that no matter who the person you're talking to is, you will say what you think. But I think also you have to realize that you need to listen back. And also another thing is you have to be willing to accept the fact that you will not always prevail. No matter how intelligent you think you are or how powerful your arguments are, you will lose. And you have to say, I fought the fight, I gave my advice, and I was overruled.
Laura, thank you very much for this very engaging and insightful conversation on your career and your service in the Clinton administration.
Thank you, Harry.
Thank you, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.